The avoidant person stays distant and cold from you, not because they don't see your value or don't recognize your worth, but because they see it too clearly, because they perceive you as better than them in fundamental ways that trigger their deep shame and their core belief that they're inadequate or damaged or unworthy of someone like you. And this perception of your superiority makes closeness feel threatening rather than desirable, because being close to you means constant confrontation with their perceived inferiority, constant awareness that they don't measure up, constant fear that you'll eventually recognize the disparity and leave them for someone more worthy. The avoidant compares themselves to you and finds themselves lacking in ways that create painful internal experience. You're more emotionally healthy and they're damaged by their attachment wounds. You're more capable of intimacy and they're defended and shut down. You're more whole and integrated and they're fragmented and conflicted. You're more emotionally intelligent and they struggle to understand or express feelings. You're more secure in yourself and they're driven by fear and shame. You're more open and generous and they're guarded and withholding. This comparison isn't necessarily accurate or fair. It's their perception filtered through their shame and their low self-worth, but it's real to them, and it creates internal narrative where being with you means being constantly reminded of their inadequacy, where your presence highlights everything they hate about themselves, where staying close to you requires facing the shame of not being enough for someone they perceive as so much better than them. The distance and coldness are protective mechanisms that manage this shame and this feeling of inadequacy by creating separation that allows them to avoid constant confrontation with the disparity they perceive, by preventing them from having to continuously fall short of what they believe you deserve, by protecting them from the anticipated eventual rejection when you finally realize they're not good enough for you and leave them for someone who is. The tragic irony is that the very qualities that make you valuable to them, your emotional health, your capacity for intimacy, your wholeness, your openness, are the same qualities that make them feel inadequate by comparison, creating impossible situation where what draws them to you is also what drives them away, where your strengths highlight their weaknesses in ways they cannot tolerate, where being with you means facing shame they've spent their life trying to avoid, how their perception of your superiority triggers their shame and distance. The avoidant person's perception that you're better than them in fundamental ways triggers their core shame and their deep sense of inadequacy in ways that make proximity to you psychologically painful, driving them to create distance as protective mechanism against the shame that closeness activates. Understanding how perceived superiority triggers shame and distance reveals the mechanism underlying their withdrawal and helps explain why being valuable and admirable can paradoxically push them away. Their perception of your superiority triggers shame because it confirms their core belief that they're fundamentally defective or damaged in ways that make them unworthy of love and connection. The avoidant carries deep shame about themselves that formed in childhood when their needs were rejected or when they learned they had to suppress their authentic self to be acceptable. This core shame creates belief that they're fundamentally flawed, that something is wrong with them, that they're damaged goods. When they encounter you with your emotional health and your capacity for intimacy and your wholeness, it activates this core shame by providing evidence that confirms their worst beliefs about themselves. You're what they're not. You're whole and they're broken. You're capable and they're limited. You're healthy and they're damaged. This confirmation of their core shame is excruciating because it takes what was internal belief and makes it external reality through comparison to you. Their perception of your superiority triggers shame because being with you means constant awareness of the gap between who they are and who they'd need to be to deserve you. The avoidant looks at you and sees someone who deserves emotionally available partner, someone who deserves consistent presence, someone who deserves vulnerability and intimacy. Then they look at themselves and recognize they cannot provide these things, that they're emotionally unavailable, inconsistent, defended against vulnerability. This gap between what you deserve and what they can provide creates shame because it highlights their inadequacy, their inability to be what good partners should be, their failure to meet basic relationship requirements that you deserve. Every moment of closeness is moment of awareness of this gap, moment of knowing they're falling short, moment of shame about their limitations. Their perception of your superiority triggers distance because proximity to you means constant triggering of the shame that distance allows them to avoid or minimize. When they're close to you, when they're in relationship with you, the comparison is constant and unavoidable. They see your emotional health contrasted with their dysfunction. They witness your capacity for intimacy that highlights their incapacity. They experience your wholeness that emphasizes their fragmentation. This constant comparison creates constant shame, constant awareness of inadequacy, constant psychological pain. Creating distance provides relief from this pain by removing the comparison, by allowing them to not be constantly confronted with the disparity, by letting them exist without continuous reminder of how they fall short. The distance is anesthetic for the shame that proximity creates. Their perception of your superiority triggers distance because they fear the inevitable moment when you'll recognize the disparity and leave them. And creating distance first allows them to control the abandonment they believe is inevitable. The avoidant believes that once you fully see who they are, once you recognize how damaged or limited they are, once you understand the gap between what you deserve and what they can provide, you'll leave. This anticipated abandonment is terrifying because it would confirm their worst fear about being unlovable and inadequate. Creating distance first, pushing you away before you can leave them, allows them to control the abandonment they believe is coming. It's less painful to leave someone because you feel inadequate than to be left by someone who confirms your inadequacy by choosing to leave. The distance is preemptive abandonment that protects against the more painful abandonment they fear you'll eventually inflict. Their perception of your superiority triggers distance because being close to you requires vulnerability and emotional availability. They associate with weakness, and feeling inferior to you already makes them feel weak and exposed. The avoidant experiences closeness and vulnerability as dangerous weakness that makes them susceptible to being hurt or controlled. When they already feel inferior to you, when they already feel at disadvantage in the dynamic, adding vulnerability feels like compounding their weakness, like making themselves even more powerless in relationship where they already feel they have less power. The distance protects against this compounded vulnerability by allowing them to maintain some power through emotional unavailability, by keeping some control through withholding, by preventing themselves from being completely exposed and vulnerable to someone they perceive as superior and therefore potentially dangerous to their psychological safety. Their perception of your superiority triggers distance because closeness means risking disappointment or judgment from someone whose opinion matters more because they're perceived as better, making potential rejection more devastating. When the avoidant feels inferior to you, when they see you as better than them, your opinion and your judgment carry more weight. Disappointing someone they see as equal or inferior might be tolerable, but disappointing someone they perceive as superior feels more significant and more shameful. The risk of your judgment or your rejection becomes intolerable because it would come from someone whose opinion they value highly. Due to their perception of your superiority, Distance protects against this risk by preventing situations where they might disappoint you or where you might judge them, by keeping enough separation that your potential negative evaluation feels less immediate and less devastating. Their perception of your superiority triggers distance, because maintaining the distance allows them to preserve idealized version of themselves that closeness would destroy through revelation of their actual limitations. From distance, the avoidant can maintain some illusion about themselves, can avoid full confrontation with their limitations, can preserve some dignity. But closeness to you, relationship with you, would require revealing themselves fully, revealing their emotional limitations, their defensive patterns, their inability to sustain intimacy. This revelation would destroy any illusion of adequacy they're maintaining and would make the comparison to you even more painful by making their limitations explicit and undeniable. The distance allows them to avoid this complete revelation, to preserve some sense of self that closeness would obliterate through forced confrontation with exactly how inadequate they feel compared to you. The specific ways they see you as better and what this comparison does to them. The avoidant person's perception of your superiority is based on specific qualities and capacities they observe in you that they compare to their own limitations, and understanding these specific comparisons reveals both what they admire about you and what triggers their shame and their withdrawal. These comparisons, while sometimes based on real differences, are often exaggerated by their shame and their tendency towards self-criticism. They see you as better because you're emotionally available and capable of vulnerability, while they're defended and shut down, making them feel emotionally stunted and damaged by a comparison. You can express your feelings. You can be vulnerable. You can cry or show hurt or admit fear. You're comfortable with emotional intimacy and with sharing your internal experience. The avoidant observes this emotional capacity and compares it to their own emotional limitation. They cannot express feelings easily. They cannot be vulnerable without intense anxiety. They shut down when emotions become too intense. This comparison makes them feel fundamentally broken emotionally, like they're operating with deficit that makes them less evolved or less human than you. The shame of this emotional inadequacy makes closeness to you painful, because your emotional availability constantly highlights their emotional unavailability in ways that make them feel defective. They see you as better because you can maintain relationships and connections with apparent ease while they destroy relationships through their patterns, making them feel relationally incompetent. You have healthy friendships. You maintain connections with family. You've had relationships that ended amicably, or at least without the destruction their patterns create. You seem to know how to do relationships in ways they don't understand. This comparison makes them feel fundamentally incompetent at basic human task of maintaining relationships, like everyone got manual for how to connect with others and they missed it. The shame of this relational incompetence makes them feel they don't deserve you because you're clearly capable of healthy relationship while they're clearly not. And being with you means constantly being reminded of their inability to do what seems to come naturally to you. They see you as better because you're secure in yourself and know your worth, while they're driven by shame and fear and deep insecurity about their value. You carry yourself with confidence. You know what you deserve. You maintain boundaries that come from self-respect rather than from fear. You don't seem plagued by the constant self-doubt and self-criticism that dominates their internal experience. This comparison makes them feel fundamentally insecure and unstable compared to your groundedness and self-assurance. The shame of their insecurity feels especially acute next to your security, making them feel they're bringing instability and self-doubt into relationship with someone who has their shit together in ways they never will. Being close to you means constant awareness of how unstable and insecure they are compared to your stability and confidence. They see you as better because you're emotionally intelligent and understand relationship dynamics while they're confused and overwhelmed by emotional complexity. You seem to understand what's happening in the relationship. You can identify patterns. You can articulate feelings and dynamics. You have psychological insight that helps you navigate complexity. The avoidant feels emotionally illiterate by comparison. They don't understand their own feelings or patterns. They're confused by relationship dynamics. They lack the language or the insight to make sense of what's happening. This comparison makes them feel intellectually or emotionally inferior, like you're operating at level they cannot reach. The shame of this emotional ignorance makes being with you feel like being constantly reminded of their lack of understanding, like being the dumb one in relationship with someone much smarter about emotions and relationships. They see you as better because you've done healing work or therapy while they're still avoiding their wounds, making them feel like you're evolved while they're stuck. You talk about your therapy or your healing work. You demonstrate growth and self-awareness that comes from addressing your wounds. You've clearly done work on yourself that shows in your emotional health and your relational capacity. The avoidant compares this to their own avoidance of therapeutic work, their refusal to address their wounds, their stagnation in patterns they've had for years or decades. This comparison makes them feel like you're on growth trajectory that's leaving them behind, like you're evolved human working on yourself while they're stuck in same dysfunction year after year. The shame of their stagnation compared to your growth makes closeness feel like being reminded constantly of their failure to do the work that might make them worthy of you. They see you as better because you're generous and giving while they're withholding and guarded, making them feel selfish and emotionally stingy. You give freely your time, your attention, your emotional support, your care. You're generous with your love and your presence. The avoidant observes this generosity and compares it to their own withholding. They guard their time. They ration their attention. They cannot give emotionally in ways that feel risky. This comparison makes them feel fundamentally selfish and stingy, like they're taking from you constantly while giving little in return, like they're emotional miser compared to your abundance. The shame of their withholding feels especially acute when contrasted with your generosity, making them feel their inferior partner who cannot match your giving nature. They see you as better because you can handle conflict and difficult conversations while they shut down or run away, making them feel cowardly and avoidant. You can stay present during conflict. You can have difficult conversations. You can work through issues rather than avoiding them. The avoidant compares this to their own tendency to shut down, to withdraw, to flee from conflict or difficult topics. This comparison makes them feel cowardly and weak, like you're brave enough to face difficulties while they're too scared or too limited to stay present. The shame of their avoidance compared to your courage makes them feel fundamentally inadequate as partner and as person. Why feeling inferior to you makes closeness unbearable rather than motivating. The avoidant person's feeling of being inferior to you logically could motivate them to grow or to work on themselves to close the gap they perceive, but instead the feeling makes closeness to you unbearable and drives them away. And understanding why inferiority creates distance rather than motivation reveals both their psychological structure and their fundamental limitations. This counterintuitive response illuminates why being better doesn't inspire them, but instead repels them. Feeling inferior makes closeness unbearable rather than motivating, because the avoidance shame is so intense that proximity to reminders of that shame is psychologically intolerable, requiring distance for basic emotional survival. For shame to motivate growth, person must have enough psychological resilience to sit with shame while taking action to address it. But the avoidance shame is overwhelming and consuming rather than motivating. When they're close to you, when they're constantly reminded of their perceived inadequacy, the shame becomes unbearable. Their psychological system prioritizes managing this shame over any growth agenda, and managing overwhelming shame requires distance from the source of the shame. Being with you feels like being in constant state of psychological emergency, where shame is so activated that all energy goes to managing it rather than to doing work to address the inadequacy creating it. Distance provides shame, relief, that closeness prevents, making distance feel like survival necessity rather than like avoidance of growth opportunity. Feeling inferior makes closeness unbearable rather than motivating, because growth and change would require vulnerability and asking for help with someone they already feel inferior to, compounding their shame rather than relieving it. If the avoidant recognized they needed to grow to be worthy of you, logically they might work on themselves, seek therapy, address their patterns. But doing this work would require admitting inadequacy, asking for help, being vulnerable about their limitations, all of which feel more shameful and more exposing with someone they already feel inferior to. Admitting to you that they need therapy or that they're working on themselves would mean acknowledging the inadequacy they're already ashamed of. It feels less shameful to maintain distance and avoid the relationship than to stay close while having to continuously acknowledge their need for growth and their current inadequacy. The distance protects against compounded shame of having to reveal inadequacy to someone who already makes them feel inadequate. Feeling inferior makes closeness unbearable rather than motivating, because the avoidant doesn't believe growth is possible for them, that they're fundamentally damaged in ways that cannot be changed, making trying feel futile. For feeling inferior to motivate growth, person must believe growth is possible, that they can close the gap, that work will yield results. But the avoidant often has deeply pessimistic view of their capacity for change. They see themselves as fundamentally damaged, as broken in ways that cannot be fixed, as having patterns that are too entrenched to change. When they feel inferior to you, when they see the gap between your capacities and theirs, they don't see it as gap that could be closed through work. They see it as permanent deficit reflecting fundamental difference in who you are versus who they are. This hopelessness about change makes trying feel pointless, making distance feel like only realistic option, since they cannot become different enough to deserve you anyway. Feeling inferior makes closeness unbearable rather than motivating, because the work required to address their inadequacy is terrifying and overwhelming, making avoidance feel safer than engagement. The avoidant knows at some level what addressing their inadequacy would require: therapy, vulnerability, sitting with painful feelings, confronting childhood wounds, changing entrenched patterns, tolerating discomfort. This work is genuinely difficult and genuinely frightening. When they feel inferior to you, when they recognize how much work would be required to close the gap, the magnitude of what they need to do feels overwhelming. Distance from you means distance from confronting the necessity of this work, means they can continue avoiding the terrifying process of change, means they don't have to face the overwhelming task of becoming someone different. Being with you would mean constant reminder of the work they're not doing, constant pressure, even if only internal, to change, constant awareness of the gap. Distance allows avoidance of the work by removing the person who makes the work feel necessary. Feeling inferior makes closeness unbearable rather than motivating, because they fear that even if they did the work and grew, you might not be available anymore, or might have moved on to someone better, making the effort feel risky and potentially unrewarded. If the avoidant committed to growth, went to therapy, addressed their patterns, developed new capacities, all of this would take time, potentially years. They fear that by the time they'd done enough work to feel worthy of you, you'd be gone. You'd have found someone else, someone who was already capable, someone who didn't need years of work to be good partner. This fear makes staying close feel pointless because if the ending is inevitable, either you leave because they're not good enough now, or you leave during the years of work they'd need to do, or they do the work and you're gone by the time they're ready. Then why subject themselves to the pain of closeness when the outcome is loss either way? Distance at least provides immediate relief, even if it guarantees the loss they fear is inevitable anyway. Feeling inferior makes closeness unbearable rather than motivating, because being with you while feeling inferior creates power dynamic, where they feel worn down and vulnerable to being controlled or hurt, making distance feel safer than the vulnerability closeness requires. When the avoidant feels inferior to you, when they see you as better, it creates psychological position where you have more power. Power in relationship goes to the person who needs the relationship less, who has more options, who is more valuable. Feeling inferior means feeling less valuable, which means feeling they need you more than you need them, which means feeling powerless and vulnerable. This vulnerability to potential hurt or rejection from someone with more power feels dangerous to their system that's organized around protecting against vulnerability. Distance rebalances the power by removing them from relationship entirely, restoring their sense of control and safety, even at cost of losing the connection. Feeling inferior makes closeness unbearable rather than motivating, because the avoidance defensive system is organized around avoiding shame and maintaining self-protection, and these defensive priorities override any growth-oriented impulses the inferiority might theoretically create. At fundamental level, the avoidance psychological organization prioritizes defense over growth, protection over development, avoiding pain over pursuing positive change. When feeling inferior creates shame and threatens their defenses, their system responds with increased defensiveness rather than with openness to growth. The inferiority activates their shame, which activates their defenses, which creates distance. This is automatic defensive sequence that operates below conscious choice. Even if they intellectually recognize that growing would address the inferiority, their defensive system overrides intellectual recognition with automatic protective response of creating distance from the shame source. What their perception of your superiority means for you and your healing. The avoidance perception that you're better than them and their resulting distance has specific implications for your understanding of their behavior and for your healing process. Understanding what their perception means for you helps you interpret their distance accurately and make decisions that serve your well-being rather than their defensive needs. Their perception of your superiority means their distance is fundamentally about their shame and their limitations, not about your inadequacy or lack of value, protecting your self-worth from being damaged by their withdrawal. You might internalize their distance as evidence that you weren't good enough, weren't desirable enough, didn't matter enough. But understanding that they see you as better than them, that they're creating distance because of their feelings of inadequacy, completely inverts this interpretation. Their distance is not evidence of your insufficiency. It's evidence of their perception of your excellence. They're not leaving because you're not enough. They're leaving because they feel they're not enough for you. This understanding protects your self-worth by helping you recognize that their behavior is about their internal shame rather than about external reality of your value. Their perception of your superiority means you should not diminish yourself or hide your strengths to make them more comfortable, as this would be sacrificing yourself too. Manage their shame rather than honoring your own worth. Understanding that your emotional health or your capacities trigger their inadequacy might tempt you to downplay these qualities, to be less emotionally available, to hide your strengths, to make yourself smaller so they feel less inadequate by comparison. But this would be profound self-betrayal. Your emotional health is gift, not problem. Your capacities are strengths, not flaws. Diminishing yourself to manage someone else's shame is sacrificing your well-being for their comfort. Teaching yourself that your excellence is problem, rather than recognizing that their shame is theirs to address. Honor yourself by refusing to make yourself less, to make them feel adequate. Their perception of your superiority means their feelings of inadequacy are their responsibility to address through their own work, not your responsibility to manage or fix. You cannot make them feel adequate. You cannot fix their shame. You cannot do the work for them that would address their feelings of inadequacy. These are internal experiences they must work through in therapy and through their own growth process. Trying to make them feel adequate by reassuring them or by diminishing yourself or by accepting less than you deserve only enables their avoidance of the real work they need to do. Their feelings of inadequacy in relation to you might be catalyst for growth if they choose to use them that way, but whether they choose growth is entirely their responsibility, not yours to engineer or to manage. Their perception of your superiority means you deserve a partner who celebrates your strengths rather than being threatened by them, who sees your capacities as assets rather than as comparisons that trigger their shame. The right partner for you will appreciate your emotional health, will value your capacities, will celebrate your strengths. They'll see your wholeness as gift to the relationship rather than as reminder of their inadequacy. They'll match your capacities, or they'll be inspired by them to grow, but they won't be threatened by them or withdraw from them. Understanding that the avoidant is threatened by the very qualities that should be valued helps you recognize you need different kind of partner, someone secure enough in themselves that your excellence enhances rather than threatens them. Their perception of your superiority means staying with them or waiting for them would require you to accept partner who cannot appreciate or match your capacities, accepting less than you deserve. If the avoidant sees you as better, and this triggers their shame and distance, staying with them means being with someone who cannot fully appreciate you, who experiences your strengths as threats, who withdraws from the very qualities that make you valuable. This is settling for insufficient partnership where your excellence is problem rather than asset. Use this understanding to recognize that you deserve relationship where you're celebrated rather than where you trigger shame, where your partner rises to meet you rather than withdrawing from you. Their perception of your superiority means their potential growth or change is uncertain and should not be a factor in your decisions about waiting or remaining available. Even if feeling inadequate could theoretically motivate them to grow, even if they might eventually do work to address their shame and their limitations, this growth is uncertain and is entirely their journey to choose or not choose. You cannot wait indefinitely for growth that may never happen. You cannot organize your life around hope that they'll eventually feel adequate enough to be with you. Make decisions based on their current capacity and their current behavior, not on theoretical future growth. Their feelings of inadequacy are real and are a significant barrier to relationship with you that exists now and that may exist indefinitely. Without therapeutic intervention, they may never pursue. Their perception of your superiority ultimately means you should move forward with your life, honoring your worth and your capacities by choosing partnerships where these qualities are valued rather than threatening. The highest honoring of yourself and your worth is not to diminish yourself to make insecure people comfortable, but to choose people and situations where your worth is recognized and celebrated. Move forward from the avoidant, not because you don't care about them or don't understand their shame, but because you understand that being with someone who is threatened by your strengths is not sustainable or healthy for you. Find partners who see your emotional health and think, what a gift, rather than what a reminder of my inadequacy, who see your capacities and think, what amazing person to build life with, rather than what comparison that makes me feel inferior. You are better than they think they are, not because you're actually superior, but because you've done work and you have capacities. And these qualities deserve to be honored by being shared with someone who can receive them, appreciate them, and match them, not hidden or diminished to make someone comfortable with their own unaddressed shame.